After another wait, welcome to the final video in my series on how AM2's Big 4 superscalers were ported to Sega's home consoles. If you haven't watched my first two videos, have a look by following the links on screen. So the final ports I'll look at are on the Sega Saturn as part of the Sega Ages collection in the UK, and developed by the little known Retubo Games. Sadly, we only received one instalment of this series, with many more classic games being available in Japan, but this collection does include 3 of the games we're looking at: Space Harrier, Outrun and Afterburner. We could have looked at some Sega CD and 32X ports as well, but I don't have access to those games, and with the Saturn's famed 2D powers at disposal, surely this should be the best place to get that arcade perfect gameplay we're looking for. Let's have a look. Before we get to the Sega Ages collection, there was actually a Hang-On game released on the Saturn, On GP in '96. Developed by Sega CS R&D, this sort of sequel was an early attempt to get more first-party 3D games on the Saturn, and overall is pretty poor. I don't have the game anymore, but I can assure you that it doesn't play well, with floaty controls that feel very disconnected to the road, and a camera that follows quite rigidly behind, and terrible sound effects. This is a game you should definitely give a miss on the Saturn. Later in 1996, Sega Ages Volume 1 launched in the UK, and it's here we can really see the sprite scaling power of the Sega Saturn. Unlike the Mega Drive's respectable Space Harrier sequel, the Saturn received a full and nigh on perfect port of the arcade game. The 32X had got its own port in '95, and while very close, it does suffer from regular frame drops when the screen fills with moving sprites. Not so on this Saturn version. Another massive step up is that the game actually supports the analog controller, although my gameplay footage isn't recorded using this. And this means the Saturn port reflects Yu Suzuki's initial decision to create the arcade game around an analog joystick to complement its flying mechanic. Sega even released a special controller just for this, the Mission Stick, and although quite hard to find now, I'm sure it would recreate an even more authentic experience. The music sounds just as fantastic, the graphics are super fast and smooth, the controls are the best of the home ports. I'm still terrible at the game, but this really might be the best way to play Space Harrier at home. Outrun on the Mega Drive is a port that really disappoints me, and the lack of dedicated scaling hardware in the console is the main culprit. But like the Space Harrier port, Outrun on the Sega Ages collection for the Saturn is again nigh on perfect and such a joy to play. The console scrolling hardware means we get a perfectly smooth port of the arcade game, and again the analog controller gives you a far greater degree of control than in previous ports. The Saturn port also benefits from being able to use the arcade racer with the game. It's fantastic to use, and it's another way that the Sega Ages collection for Saturn allows you to have a very authentic arcade experience if you have the right hardware. There's even a hidden 60 frames per second mode, on NTSC games at least, making the frame rate even higher than the arcade version of 30. Because it's an exact port, again we get a perfect soundtrack, and this makes for a perfect port of one of the best driving games of all time. Afterburner 2 on the Mega Drive was a good step in the right direction after the awful Master System port, but it still felt very cut down and the screen always looked a bit empty. The Saturn port is again direct from the arcade and completes the Afterburner experience at home with full analog control and joystick support. The 32X received Afterburner Complete around the same time as its Space Harrier port, but that topped out at 30 frames per second, and on Saturn you get full 60 again on NTSC. Now the screen can fill up with sprites and it goes at a lightning pace, just as Afterburner should. It's still the most difficult to play out of the Big 4, and arguably the most shallow. But with such a memorable soundtrack and impressive scaling effects, Afterburner remains a showstopper for Sega, and like Space Harrier and Outrun, probably finds its best home outside the arcade on the Saturn. Well, that was quite simple, wasn't it? Put arcade sprite scaling games on a powerful 2D console with built-in scaling hardware and you get the best home versions of them. That's no great surprise really, so let's have a quick look at some oddities to get a bit more out of this video. Another Sega console that received ports of their arcade games was their oversized handheld, the Game Gear. Basically a portable Master System that drank batteries. Let's see if it got any ports of the games we've looked at in this series. The Game Gear didn't get a port of Hang-On, but it did get a port of GP Ryder in '94, a sort of sequel to Hang-On itself. GP Ryder is quite a different game than Hang-On in the arcade, but on Game Gear it actually plays a lot like Super Hang-On for the Mega Drive. Aside from a confused sense of identity and being a very simple game overall, graphically it's pretty good considering the host platform, and the sense of speed and smoothness in the game is quite strong. Next up, the Game Gear did get its own port of Space Harrier in '91. It's very similar to the Master System version, but it has some new enemy designs and obviously much less screen space. This is sadly another version of Space Harrier that I can't stand, as just like the Master System version, it uses some kind of background tiles for its sprites, meaning that everything that moves has an ugly empty box around it. Outrun Fares better, also released on the Game Gear in '91, and it's a new version again, rather than copying the Master System port. The tracks feel even sparser than that version, with very little trackside detail, and barely any other cars, but the scrolling and sense of speed is pretty smooth. The road remains quite flat though, which is a noticeable change from the rolling hills of some other versions. Finally, the Game Gear didn't get a port of Afterburner, but it did get G-Lock Air Battle in '91, another sort of sequel to Afterburner. Sega clearly had lots of crossover amongst its arcade games at the time. G-Lock was infamous for having the R360 Tycoon cabinet in the arcade, but it's a terrible game on the Game Gear. Slow controls, choppy scrolling, and a small area of gameplay just make this a chore. Looking at this alongside Space Harrier for the Game Gear, I think it's safe to say the hardware of the time just wasn't fit for into-the-screen shooters. And so we conclude. After looking at 16 different games across 4 different platforms, it's hardly surprising that the Sega Saturn is the best place to play these superscalers at home. Well, 3 out of 4 of them at least. There are other places you can play these games as well. They appear sporadically on Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, but by then the hardware was more than capable of replicating these games. What's interesting is seeing the steps that Sega had to take in bringing these super powerful games home at the time. This was a time when anything you played in the arcades was years in advance of your home consoles. Of course, while the Saturn could perfectly host superscalar games of the late 80s, it infamously struggled to cope with their demanding 3D games of the mid-90s, but we'll look at that in a later video. It wasn't Sega's priority for the Saturn, but luckily for gamers of a certain persuasion, the Saturn could at least provide a perfect home for some of Yu Suzuki's pioneering arcade games. If you've watched this far, thank you very much, and please subscribe to the channel. Comment below if you've played these games before, and until the next time, happy gaming.